Okay, great. Welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our third and final Talking the Walk reflections on 360 Riot Walk, What's at Stake. My name is Louise Mott and I am the production coordinator at the Powell Street Festival Society. To begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Kwantlen, Stalo, Tawasin, Musqueam, Chemainus, and the Hulkaminum peoples. I live, work, play, and rest on both these lands and waters while being aware that they are unceded, meaning that the land was never signed away and is effectively stolen land. As a Chinese Canadian, today's panel makes me think about how others like me might have been affected by the 1907 anti-Asian riots. Although this occurred over a century ago, racial discrimination and attempts at displacement continue to happen today towards both Indigenous and other marginalized communities. Powell Street Festival takes place in the neighborhood where the riots occurred. Through my work here, I've been able to learn about and reflect on my relationship with the land, the historical significance of the neighborhood and its people, and the systems of oppression that continue to exist. Let's remember and learn from the mistakes of the past to work towards being good stewards of the land that we all share today. This means that beyond just caring for the land, we must be respectful neighbors to all who share it, especially by seeking allyship with Indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities. As we hear from the panelists today, I invite you to join me in the spirit of engagement, reflection, and collaboration. This series is hosted by the Powell Street Festival in partnership with the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Classical Chinese Garden, with financial support from Canada Council for the Arts and BC Arts Council. We sincerely thank everyone who has made donations to this event, and we appreciate your continued support and participation. Here are a few housekeeping notes before we start. We are recording the guest presentations, and these will be available on Powell Street Festival's YouTube channel afterwards. The panelists and speakers will be spotlighted when presenting, so you do not need to change your viewing options. And just a friendly reminder to keep yourselves on mute so we don't have any interruptions during our presentation. There will also be a Q&A portion after the panelists' presentations, and at any point during the presentation, we ask that you please write your questions in the chat box, and these questions will be shared with our panelists by our guest host, Henry. Lastly, now allow me to introduce Henry Zheng, the creator of 360 Riot Walk. Henry is an artist and occasional curator whose projects explore spatial politics of history, language, community, food, and cultural translation in relationship to place. Henry teaches at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. Over to you, Henry.
Thanks, Louise, and everybody at Powell Street Festival, and Debbie Jung for your work on the series. And thanks everyone for tuning in today to today's panel, the third and final in Talking the Walk, that uses 360 Riot Walk as an entry point to explore the history of anti-Asian violence and white supremacy in Vancouver. The first panel in the series was entitled An Embodied Experience of History with Sue Sean, Catherine Benai, and Debbie Jung, who, as former participants from the guided walking tours, they shared their insights into their embodied experience of using virtual reality technology to invoke site-specific histories. The second panel was called The Complexity and Nuance of Cultural Translation, with Catherine Chan, Yurie Hoyoyon, and Masha Carr, who were the translators for the Punjabi, Chinese, and Japanese versions of the project. They addressed the power and subtleties of language and the challenges they encountered in translating the script of 360 Riot Walk. And for those who missed these previous sessions, you can catch the recordings on Powell Street Festival's website or the 360 Riot Walk website. We'll post that in the chat column for the URL so you can access that if you wish. And also I want to announce that following today's panel, around 3:30, we'll be releasing the tickets for the summer's guided tours of 360 Riot Walk, hosted by the Powell Street Festival in partnership with the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Classical Chinese Garden and the Japanese Language School and the Japanese Hall. The dates are July 24th and 25th, the weekend, Saturday, Sunday. The 25th, the Sunday, will have a Punjabi interpreter. That's already been pre-sold. It's already been pre-arranged, sorry. But anyone can listen to the Punjabi on any of these tours. July 31st and August 1st, which is actually the weekend of the Powell Street Festival. The 31st, the Saturday, will have there will be an interpretation in Cantonese, and the August 1st will have a Japanese interpreter. And September 11th, which is a Saturday, I believe it's a Saturday, and that's actually the anniversary of the riots, because the riots were September 6th and 7th, but in 1907, that was the weekend after Labor Day. So they had the organizers, Asiatic Exclusion League, wanted specifically to have it on not the holiday, but the weekend after that. Tablets and headphones will be provided along with a post-tour discussion. These guided tours are free, but they're limited to 10 participants per tour. And we've offered them last summer and the summer before, and the tickets go fast. And these
made them run because they're too quiet. Oh.
Hello, what? These tickets will be available on Eventbrite. And again, the URL will be posted in the chat on your right. So for today's panel, what's at stake? It's an attempt to provide more context to some of the issues brought up by 360 Riot Walk, and to expand on the research that Michael Barnholden and I did for the script, which brought up so many questions that begged further exploration. So we reached out to others to contribute their knowledge and experience in some of these areas. And they wrote short essays that are available or will soon be available on the 360 website. Today's panel consists of these writers. Melody Ma will speak about the current challenges that Chinatown is facing today, especially in regards to the pressures of skyrocketing land prices and local activist resistance to gentrification. Then Michael Barnholden will talk about the role that organized labor played in founding the local chapter of the Asiatic Exclusion League in Vancouver, and its first public demonstration and parade that sparked the 1907 anti-Asian riot. He'll be followed by historian Paul Engelsberg, who will discuss the Bellingham riot, which occurred 3 days before Vancouver's, also organized by the local chapter of the Asiatic Exclusion League, when South Asian mill workers were rounded up and attacked by hundreds of angry white men, then loaded onto trains or force-marched out of town, many of whom ended up in Vancouver just in time to witness our own race riot here. And by the way, Bellingham had already expelled all the Chinese back in 1885. So there weren't any more to expel. And finally, Angela May will share with us the reasons why we should be referring to the historic neighborhood where the Japanese Canadians lived as Paurugai and not Japantown. First up is Melody Ma. Melody is a community organizer and neighborhood advocate for Vancouver's Chinatown. She led a campaign called #SaveChinatownYVR that helped defeat a controversial development project at 105 Kiefer. In 2018, she coordinated the Chinatown Summer Events series as a way for the community to reclaim space. Melody is also a writer on urban issues, and her opinion editorials have appeared in the Tyee, Toronto Star, Vancouver Sun, Georgia Straight, and the Globe and Mail. Melody.
Thank you. On my desktop right now. Is this good? Do we see anything?
Sorry, we can't see your screen.
How about now?
That's great. Thank
Okay,
you.
perfect. Great, thank you. Rearrange myself. Okay, so this is Little Melody at the Lunar New Year Parade many years ago. This is me in Chinatown. This is where I learned my language, going to Chinese school. This is where I learned Chinese dancing. This is where I was able to not just learn about my culture, but actually live my culture. As someone who was born and raised here, I never went to China until I was in my teens. I've only been there twice. So everything I learned about my culture, language, food, really came from Chinatown. And as a kid, it was drilled into me that there was this Chinese Exclusion Act where Chinese people weren't welcomed in Canada and had to pay a head tax. But despite going to Chinese school and English school in Chinatown and Strathcona, something that I didn't know until my advocacy work, in the last 5 years, was about the anti-Asian riots. And through getting involved in this, I've learned even more about this time in 1907. I didn't even know that even the mayor of Vancouver, his wife, Christian leaders, labor unions, all came together to target Chinese people and Asian people and their businesses. And a few years ago, I actually traveled to Seattle and went to the amazing Wing Luke Museum in Seattle, Chinatown. And there I learned that this exclusion and the anti-Asian riots wasn't isolated to Vancouver, and in fact was a franchise from the US. So in Tacoma, Seattle, San Francisco, there were anti-Asian riots. And it's not just even isolated in the West Coast, specifically along California and Washington, but even in Denver, Wyoming, and even Mexico. When I spent some time in Mexico, and they have an amazing Chinatown in Mexico City. And there I learned that there was a massacre that happened, not in Mexico City, but more towards the north of Mexico. And 300 Chinese people were killed. Similar histories where Chinese people were brought to construct the railroad, labor dispute, and that ended up in a riot and ultimately a massacre. So here's a map of all of the anti-Asian riots that has happened around North America West. And you can see it's not just the West Coast, but it goes down into the States, Mexico, and up towards Alaska. But despite all this anti-Asian hate, one thing that people love about Chinese culture is a Chinese barbecue. And again, I didn't know that Chinese barbecue was even under attack. And in the 70s, you can see here, Save Chinatown, something that's going to be a common theme that's going to keep on repeating, where there was a targeted attempt to actually eliminate Chinese barbecue products because it was said that the meat wasn't stored at the right temperatures. So that caused this campaign to happen to even not just say, to save Chinese food. And also in the 70s, there was this movement on urban renewal. And urban renewal is essentially saying, hey, look at these places where it's blighted, it's a slum, let's clear it, and let's instead put freeways and expressways through these places so that we can find more efficient use and more efficient use through moving cars more efficiently and moving people more efficiently. And of course, Vancouver's Chinatown and Strathcona was considered a slum and a blighted area and was targeted for a freeway expansion. And again, the community rose up to say, don't kill Chinatown with this freeway. And ultimately, the freeway didn't happen. It's one of the cities where we don't have a freeway. But unfortunately, there's still the Georgia Viaduct that went through the Hogan's Alley community, where there were Black folks, as well as Chinese businesses and homes that were expropriated and eliminated. But this urban renewal wasn't just, again, isolated in Vancouver, also happened in Boston and Philadelphia. Again, you can see Help Save Chinatown, the slogan that occurs again and again. In New York City, right here is Chinatown. Robert Moses, the grandfather of urban renewal, wanted to build these expressways. Thank goodness there was someone called Jane Jacobs who protested, and Chinatown is still here. Whereas in Seattle, if you visited the Chinatown International District, you can actually see that their Chinatown International District is split into two by this freeway that goes right through. And now they're trying to reclaim it by adding these murals. And then on top of it, Seattle also had the Kingdom, a sports complex that was going to be built. And it is now built. And there were concerns that that would turn Chinatown into a place where it's just hot dog stands and parking lots for the visitors to Kingdom. And again, the community rose up and protested. Now in Vancouver, we have a new wave of pressures, and that's gentrification. This is a beautiful mural on a 100-year-old Wong Benevolent Society building, where the Wong family and anybody with the Wong last name can gather, play mahjong, and live their culture. Instead of this mural, now we have this physical golden block of micro suites called Brixton Flats, where at the bottom right now is a juicery where you can get very expensive juices. And apparently one of them is called Karen, and I'm not even kidding. This is the advocacy work that I was involved in that really got me down to this journey of understanding more about the history of Chinatown. This is the 105 Kiefer building, luxury condo building that was proposed right next to a memorial plaza for Chinese veterans as well as railway workers. And again, an intergenerational community of people from Chinatown kind of came together to stop this building, not just once, but 3 times. And what were we protecting? We want to ensure that places like this, Gien-Wha, still exist, where people can have affordable, culturally appropriate meals with dignity. Instead, what we're seeing right now are these new businesses, such as this one, where you can see that the aesthetic of the place, the products that are being offered, the people, the smell, the language is fundamentally different and changing. And those places are called zones of exclusion. So this was a study done to map out the gentrifying retail and zones of exclusion in the downtown east side. And you can see all these spots becoming denser and denser and denser. One Chinatown, the activist likes to point to as, you know, if at the end of the day this keeps on happening, what would the Chinatown look like? Is the Chinatown in Washington, D.C. I was there many, many years ago, and I actually had to think, is this actually a real Chinatown? Because it looks awfully like Disneyland. And the reason was that there were a lot of these brands like Hooters and Chipotle that were all over this Chinatown. And what happened was their city council, instead of putting in policies that really preserve the heritage of the place, they said, well, you know, if people are complaining, let's just get all these businesses to translate their signage into Chinese, and that will solve the problem. And this is why we have Hooters and Chipotle in Chinese. This is Seattle's Chinatown International District, where this building was proposed and it's now, I think it's even under construction right now. This is Calgary. This is Toronto, the Bright Pearl restaurant has turned dark. This is LA, where the architects said that it fit into the neighborhood. This is New York, where there's constant protests around gentrification and that Chinatown is not for sale. And now coming to the present day, we have Kung Flu, we have anti-Asian violence and hate. And I'm going to spare you with some of the imagery here, but over the last year, it's caused a reawakening to reckon that Chinese people and Asian people are not an exception, that we are still another. So in Vancouver, how this has manifested includes, here, this is the gates of Chinatown. This one was as recent as a week ago, where gun violence was depicted on the murals of Chinatown. And of course, with COVID, it has really hit the Chinatown businesses even way earlier on before it hit the rest of the businesses in Vancouver. And it's been really tough for the businesses, and it's, they haven't been able to get the support from government in order to kind of move through the pandemic. Despite all of the challenges and the consistent pressures on Chinatown, some of the things that have been done over the last while and also over the last century is to celebrate and to consistently demonstrate that this is a place where we should be. So for example, this is something that I was involved in, which is the Chinatown Summer Events. This is a courtyard right in front of the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens. It's a courtyard that's not typically animated. We thought, okay, after the 105 Kiefer protest, we need to flip the script and say, we're going to reclaim space and show that, we are still here as young Chinese Canadian. And so we animated the space with regular events every week, whether it's showing a film or spreading and teaching people the culture. And in terms of barbecue, there's actually a place called Chinatown Barbecue right now that some of you probably been to kind of keep on continuing the deliciousness of our culture. And during the pandemic, the Hua Foundation kind of came together to create something called Chinatown Care, which is a grocery delivery service for Chinese seniors. And again, it demonstrates the resiliency of the community and the care, the intergenerational care. And so with that, I want to say that, Chinatown consistently has these pressures that keeps on trying to knock it down, to make it disappear, whether it's urban renewal, the anti-Asian riots, or gentrification, and now with COVID. But at the same time, Chinatown is still here in Vancouver. It's still here around the world in many cities that I would frequent. And it demonstrates the resilience of Chinese people and the fact that they can withstand these pressures as a community. And so hopefully, it's unknown kind of what will happen with the double pressures on gentrification and COVID, but hopefully the resilience of Chinese people will keep on going, and that we have Chinatowns for the next century to come, so that other Chinese Canadians and other Vancouverites and other people around the world have a place to live and learn the culture.
Thanks, Melody. Our next speaker is Michael Barnholden, who has worked in construction, agriculture, childcare, disability advocacy, teaching, and publishing, which is where I first met Michael back in what, early 90s when you were at Talon Books. He has written 10 books of poetry and several nonfiction titles. His editorial work includes Writing Class, the Kootenai School of Writing Anthology, and poetry collections such as Royce Nicky's Flow and Gary Thomas Morse's forthcoming Lexicon Standoff. Michael is also a photographer, painter, and carver, which I would like to see someday. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Henry. I guess that just means I'm old. All of those things. I would first like to acknowledge that I am speaking today from Syilx Okanagan Nation on the shore of Skaha Lake here in Penticton. And I would like to acknowledge that it's been a really interesting experience to move to a new place and start to learn about the local conditions. Today, what I would like to talk about, and Louise, could you put up slide number 1? I noticed this is also the slide that Melody was using. I'm not so much interested in the picture as the classification notes from the VPL, and that they identify this as Chinese businesses damaged by race riots at the northwest corner of Carroll Street, at what is now Pender. Now, really, over the years, have looked at these as race riots, but there's another factor that I believe we need to look at carefully, and that is that these were, in fact, race riots confuses the issues in that because the racialized people, the Chinese and the Japanese, in fact, were not rioting. It was, in fact, a white riot, and mainly organized, as Melody pointed out, by labor groups, the Vancouver Trade and Labor Congress, but also who were the main organizers of the Asiatic Exclusion League. The Vancouver Trades and Labor Council was modeled on similar organizations up and down the West Coast, and the Asiatic Exclusion League also existed up and down the West Coast of North America. So it also is quite clear from newspaper coverage, especially in the Chinese and Japanese press, where letter writers after the riots were very clear in identifying that labor was one of the most active organizers. Religious leaders were also involved, politicians. I'm sure that the Loyal Order of Orange was also involved. So the newly organized Vancouver chapter of the Asiatic Exclusion League, this was their first public event. It began at the Cambie Street grounds and was followed by a parade complete with a military marching band to City Hall, where labor leaders, politicians, and religious leaders delivered speeches demanding the exclusion of Asiatics from the white man's province of British Columbia. Louise, could you put up slide number 2 now, please? Estimates of the size of the crowd that formed outside City Hall vary from 4,000 to 10,000, a sizable portion of the city's population. The public market on the ground floor of the City Hall building could hold about 2,000 people. So a sizable crowd gathered outside on the street at the corner of what is now Main and Hastings. The VTLC, which was founded in 1889, was mainly made up of various trade and craft unions, such as carpenters, plumbers, plasterers, etc. The New York Stock Exchange was in serious trouble and by mid-October would have to be bailed out. capitalism was in one of its periodic crises. Organized labor on the West Coast blamed Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Punjabis, and other Asiatics for, quote, taking their jobs, and demanded government action to rectify the situations. Gentlemen's agreements and legislation were in place limiting immigration, but still large number of laborers were being imported to work in mines and build railways. Labor sharks were contracted by industrialists to supply cheap labor in order to ensure profitability. In British Columbia at the time, one of the largest employers of Asiatic laborers was James Dunsmuir, heir to the Dunsmuir coal mining and industrial fortune, who also happened to be at that time Lieutenant Governor of the province. Dunsmuir was also virulently anti-union and ignored basic health and safety measures while running some of the most dangerous mines in the world. Deaths per million tons of coal produced were about 4 times the North American average. While speeches were being delivered outside of City Hall on the evening of the riots, the largely union-led crowd outside amused themselves by burning Dunsmuir in effigy. Not because he was a rapacious capitalist, but rather because in his largely ceremonial role, he refused to read into law further exclusionary legislation. British Columbia's 1907 Immigration Act, which was designed to exclude all Oriental immigrants from British Columbia, was in violation of international treaties. He made it abundantly clear that this was not for any moral reason, but rather to keep wages down and profits high. Sorry, I'm just turning to keep track of my notes here. An old suit stuffed with rags and straw with a sign reading Dunsmuir on its chest was hung from a noose, doused in kerosene or coal oil, and lit on fire to loud cheers from the crowd. Hanging and burning someone in effigy is a time-honored tradition to ridicule and dishonor a political enemy. Given Dunsmuir's use of violent, underhanded, and often illegal tactics to break any attempts to unionize his workforce, this action would be understandable. He was quoted in testimony before a Royal Commission into Labor Relations, "I object to all unions. They simply take the management of the mine. I want the management of my own works, and if I recognize the union, I cannot have that." His tactics would also include using his government connections to call out the militia when other strike-breaking tactics failed. Before being appointed Lieutenant Governor, he was Premier of the province from 1900 to 1902. Could we have number 3, please? This is a slide of Carnegie Center on the right and City Hall on the left, and that's about, well, it would have to be after 1903 when the Carnegie Center was built. While it is clear that the VTLC organized AEL was racist in intent, it is important to note that organized labor was not totally committed to whiteness. At the same time as the VTLC was organizing the AEL, Local 526 of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, was formed as the Bows and Arrows. This Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, or Wobbly Local, was made up of mainly Indigenous workers from the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh reserves, as well as Chinese, Japanese, Punjabi, and Black workers. The local was explicitly anti-capitalist and stated in the preamble to the IWW Constitution. Louise, could we have number 4, please? The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of the working people and the few who make up the employing class of all the good things of life. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the means of production, abolish the wage system, and live in harmony with the earth. Their multiracial cross-cultural organizing met with fierce opposition from management and employers. One tactic the workers employed was to speak Chinook, a language the bosses did not understand. Among and that was among themselves when discussing union business. It is important to recognize the role of Indigenous people in the working life of the city and province. Wage slavery, as the Wobblies called it, was a foreign concept. Indigenous people not only adapted, but resisted. I can't imagine Indigenous people complaining about immigrants taking their jobs. The local did not last very long, but their struggle for class solidarity has lasting implications. The most important being that there were alternatives to the racist labor organization that resulted in the Asiatic Exclusion League and the Vancouver Anti-Asiatic Riot of 1907. Now, after the riots, the federal Minister of Labor appointed his deputy minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, to chair royal commissions into the damages sustained in the rioting. There would be one for the Japanese community and one for the Chinese community. The Japanese commission was held in November of 1907, while the Chinese commission was held in late May and early June of 1908. The royal commissions, however, did not look at the root causes that led to the rioting. Some people blamed the riot on American Asiatic Exclusion League visitors. Some blamed it on the peak in Asian immigration in 1907, caused by many Chinese and Japanese coming from Hawaii to escape an outbreak of bubonic plague there. Other possible factors include the unseasonably hot weather and the shortage of jobs due to a downturn in the economy. On the last day of testimony, November 5th, King received by wire a request to chair another royal commission, this one to be called Oriental Immigration Commission, subtitled Report of W.L. Mackenzie King, Commissioner appointed to inquire into the methods by which Oriental laborers have been induced to come to Canada. This often overlooked document suggests that the other two reports were face-saving exercises, window dressing, and this particular one was to reflect the desired outcome of the Government of Canada. The province of BC and the city of Vancouver were represented by lawyers who could call and question witnesses. The Asiatic Exclusion League also had legal representation, but did not take part in examining witnesses. According to King's introduction, the evidence provided by witnesses is over 800 typewritten pages and includes tables such as the one below. Could we have number 5, please? Louise, thank you. So that's an example of one of the pages of the report. And parts of it are available online. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about William Lyon Mackenzie King. His maternal grandfather was William Lyon Mackenzie, the first mayor of Toronto and leader of the 1837 Upper Canada Rebellion. King took a BA and MA from the University of Toronto, a law degree from Osgoode Hall. He later studied at the University of Chicago and worked with prominent progressive reformer Jane Addams at Hull House. In 1898, he went to Harvard University where he studied for an MA in political economy. In 1900, he went to Ottawa to become a deputy minister in the newly created Ministry of Labor. Could we have number 5, please, Louise?
Michael, just to let you know, we're at 14 minutes.
Okay, I will wrap it up then. In 1909, Harvard granted him a PhD degree for dissertation on Oriental immigration to Canada. It was based on this royal commission he had written in 1908 while he was Deputy Minister of Labor. In it, he argued that Canada should desire to restrict immigration from the Orient as regarded as natural, that Canada should remain a white man's country is believed to be not only desirable for economic and social reasons, but highly necessary on political and national grounds. So I can just end it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Michael. Our next speaker is Paul Engelsberg, who's an educator and, am I on? Yes, I'm on. And local historian. He was a lecturer in educational foundations at Western Washington University, that's down in Bellingham, and or down as in like, down south from Vancouver, and a professor of education at Walden University. He is currently writing a book about early Punjabi immigrants in the Pacific Northwest, with a focus on the Bellingham and Everett riots of 1907. Paul.
Thank you. Well, want to introduce myself by saying that I'm speaking to you from Ferndale, Washington, which is just north of Bellingham. But the background that you see behind me on the Zoom screen is the Bellingham Old City Hall. And I'll tell you more about that later because it figures in the story that I want to tell. The history of hostility and violence directed at Asian immigrants and settlers in North America spans many decades in both Canada and the United States. For the past 15 years or so, I've been researching various anti-Asian incidents and atrocities that occurred in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And my focus has been on Washington State and especially the riots of 1907 that occurred in Bellingham and also in Everett, Washington, against immigrants from India, many of whom were Punjabi Sikhs, but not all. I want to share my view of the anti-Asian hostilities as a conspicuous and vicious aspect of the pattern of systemic racism and white supremacy that transcended the US-Canada border. I'm going to focus on two expulsions that occurred in the Bellingham area of Chinese residents in 1885 and Punjabi immigrants in 1907. And sort of as a follow-up to Michael's presentation that focused on labor, I want to focus on the connections, on the systemic nature that included labor, but also included other actors. And that's what I'm going to focus on here. In the 1880s, Bellingham was not yet a city. There were several towns where Bellingham stands, the largest of which was Whatcom. And now Bellingham and Ferndale, where I live, are in Whatcom County. And Washington was not yet a state, it was territory. So this first example of violence happened in Whatcom in Washington Territory. And the systemic nature of the anti-Chinese movement can be seen in the involvement of the press, civic leaders, law enforcement, labor organizations, and businesses. And I want to just run through those very quickly, and then we'll get to the 1907 riot. The newspapers, the primary local newspaper was the Whatcom Reveille. It played a major role in building anti-Chinese attitudes, referring to the Chinese as lepers, coolies, and slaves. The editors initiated a boycott of Chinese businesses, refusing to hire Chinese, refusing to rent to them in order to drive them out, quote unquote, peacefully. They announced a deadline of November 1st, 1885 for the Chinese to leave. And by that time, in fact, all the Chinese but one had left. And one of the, let's see, where's my slide? Well, I'll show that later. One of the editors of this paper was among several who were indicted by a federal grand jury for depriving people of their rights. None of these who were indicted were found guilty. And this is true of just about all the atrocities that occurred at this period. No one was ever prosecuted successfully. And the Reveille was very proud of its role, of its leading role. And this, they showed all their different headlines through the month leading up to the riot. And they were very proud of their role as well as supporting the Knights of Labor. This is the slide I was looking for. This is the one man who did stay in Whatcom County. He tried to basically assimilate and he opened a small restaurant in the shore, and he laid kind of low, made some friends locally in the Birch Bay area outside of Whatcom. Civic leaders and politicians were involved in both Bellingham and Tacoma. This is a picture of the leaders in Tacoma who were prominent in the huge riot there. In Whatcom, many Chinese were arrested by the police leading up to the expulsion. So the police were complicit. And a few months after the expulsion, the Whatcom City Charter was amended to prohibit Chinese laundries. Laundries were one of the main businesses where Chinese were working. In Tacoma, the most notorious and violent anti-Chinese riot resulted in the expulsion of 700 Chinese residents, the burning of their businesses by mobs, and several injuries and deaths from exposure. Although 27 of these leaders were indicted for the riot, including the mayor, 2 city councilmen, the fire chief, a probate judge, and the president of the YMCA, none were convicted. Labor organizations were involved. Michael's talked about that. In the Canadian context, the Knights of Labor had been recently organized, and driving out the Chinese was its primary campaign. And businesses were involved, although this gets a little complicated because they benefited from the Chinese and some wanted to keep them. And in fact, with the salmon canneries growing about 15 years after the riot, the canneries started employing Chinese on a seasonal basis. But the press, the Bellingham Bay Express, continued to oppose this, as these slides show. But the Chinese who were employed in the salmon canneries were forced to live in segregated bunk houses, and they were only permitted to stay during the canning season. And there were other examples that that Melody has mentioned. 28 were killed in Rock Spring, Wyoming. 3 were killed in Issaquah, called at the time Squaw Valley. This is interesting, what I'm showing on the slide. They only had 1 coroner's report for the 3 men who were killed. They only merited 1 piece of paper. Okay, I'm going to rush through here and move on to 1907, to another example of systemic racism in the riot. And first, I'll give you a thumbnail sketch of what happened 3 days before the Vancouver riot. On the evening of September 4th, 1907, in Bellingham, Washington, a mob attacked and drove out several hundred immigrant laborers from India, referred to at the time as Hindus. In fact, most of these immigrants were Sikhs from the Punjab region. So I'll talk about them as Punjabis mostly. And I'll probably also use Indians. They had only begun to arrive in the city a year earlier, 1906, and prejudice grew in a matter of months as the numbers increased. By September 1907, there were at least 300 Punjabis in Bellingham, perhaps half of whom were hoping to find work or passing through on their way south, and the other half were working largely in lumber mills. The goal of the rioters was to force these South Asian workers from the lumber mills in the city, using beatings and threat of force to round up the men from their beds and mills. Overnight, over 100 were herded into the city jail in the basement of the city hall. That's the building that's behind me on my Zoom screen, upon an agreement worked out with the police chief. And here's a picture of some of them locked in the city hall, in the jail below the city hall. Within a few days, the goals of the mob were fulfilled. Nearly all of the South Asian workers and job seekers had left either by train or steamship for points further south along the Pacific coast, or on foot to cross back into Canada. Several of the South Asian workers were beaten, and according to spokesmen for the group, many took the threat seriously and were afraid for their lives. So they decided to all leave, even though the mayor said he'd protect them. Here's some at the train station. And the rioters were said to number at least 500, most of whom were workers, not necessarily organized by the Asiatic Exclusion League, although some historians have given them credit. Accounts describe a mob that grew and separated into groups through the night, some attacking living quarters, others marching to lumber mills. Only 5 men were arrested and jailed, and the 5 arrested rioters, guess what? They were later released and never tried due to the prosecutor's claim that no witnesses willing to testify could be found. And it's possible that those who might have testified were threatened. We don't know that. So the role, I want to just go through the role of various actors in this. First, the newspapers. As the numbers of Indian immigrants increased, articles played into yellow peril fears, immorality, disease, economic threats to labor, etc., and racial stereotypes. The press seldom depicted them as individuals or included their names, unless it was a story of a crime and an Asian immigrant was the perpetrator. They spread rumors and misinformation, such as women being disguised as men, and Canadian press did the same, I should mention. Labor and the Asiatic Exclusion League, Michael's mentioned that. They made claims of immigrant workers taking jobs from white workers, being paid less, fears of future job losses, especially unskilled work in the lumber mills. The Asiatic Exclusion League, and here one of the leaders is shown, Mr. Fowler, they organized among the unions and stoked anti-Asian fears and pushed for exclusion nationally. The police were involved too. I found evidence of selective enforcement. You'll see here that every time a quote unquote Hindu was arrested, they had to pay a fine, whereas the white drunks or people arrested for drinking, they were released with no fine typically. And if you were Negro, Black, you were fired out of town, I found. So they really had a racial way of enforcing quote unquote justice. The police were probably sympathetic with the rioters. They enabled the mob to drag the Punjabis into the City Hall jail to be held overnight. And they claimed that they couldn't have controlled the mob because there were just 9 or 10 of them and they didn't really carry weapons. The mayor was involved, although he tried to protect them. He said they had a right to be there. And they guarded the Punjabis so they could go and collect their wages before they left. And I already mentioned that they dropped the charges against those arrested. And the Bellingham City Council, interestingly enough, when they investigated this, they laid the blame not on the rioters, but on the mill owners for hiring the Punjabis in the first place. And some of these city council members were socialists, and they felt that the real culprits were the mill owners and managers. And there were other incidents up and down the coast, including, of course, the Vancouver riot 3 days later, Everett in November, California and Oregon was the only place where people actually were tried. Rioters were tried in 1910. So I want to end up by talking about sort of the brighter side. These stories were mostly unknown and untold, even to the South Asians who began to settle in the area in the 1990s and now number over 2,000 in Whatcom County. The 1907 riot was omitted from Roth's 2-volume History of Whatcom County, which is actually propping up my laptop right now, published in 1926. And for many decades, very few in Bellingham were aware of the incident. The history of anti-Asian exclusion violence is seldom included in the history taught in the schools. To raise awareness of this history and patterns of injustice, a group of us organized a series of events in 2007 to mark the 100th anniversary of the 1907 riot. The city and county officials declared a day of healing and reconciliation, and the Bellingham Herald newspaper published a series of in-depth articles on the history of the riot and the Sikh community. And then they issued an apology, a very strong apology for the role that the newspaper had played in promoting racism and exclusion. In 2014, the Sikh community produced a short documentary, We Are Not Strangers, about the riot and made it available to all on YouTube. And I invite everyone to view it. You can find the link in the resources list after my article on the Riot Walk website. In 2015, community groups marked the 125th anniversary of the anti-Chinese attacks and expulsions in events in Seattle, Tacoma, and Bellingham. In 2018, Bellingham's Arch of Healing and Reconciliation was dedicated to welcome immigrants and stand as a memorial for the Asian immigrants who were forced out in 3 separate movements: the Chinese in 1885, the immigrants from India in 1907, and the Japanese in 1942. Satpal Sidhu, born and educated in India, is a leader in the Sikh community here in Whatcom County, and he led the community effort to build the Arch of Healing and Reconciliation, a milestone in the path away from prejudice and toward reconciliation was the election of Satpal Sidhu as Whatcom County Executive in 2019. That's all I have time for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I learned a lot, and there's clearly so much more to learn as we try and understand our place in this part of the world. Next speaker, a final speaker, is Angela May, who is a PhD student, writer, and community activist. As a mixed white, non-white Japanese Canadian settler, she's committed to fighting for justice against injustice in her home of Vancouver, BC, where her work considers the legacies of displacement and the durability of memory, particularly in the city's downtown east side. Angela.
Thanks so much, Henry. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here, and I've taken a look at the attendees here, and some of you are going to be familiar with some of what I say today, but hopefully there's still something interesting. So I've been reflecting on what I wanted to share today, and I thought that it might be an idea to speak to sort of what's at stake across the broader theme that I think we've all been talking about, and that 360 Riot Walk discusses as well, and that theme is history. But to start that conversation, I'm going to begin with a place that I and my friend Nicole wrote about for 360 Riot Walk, and that place is Powell Street. So Powell Street is one of several historic homes of the Japanese Canadian community. Of these homes, Powell Street is the largest, in the sense that the greatest number of Japanese Canadians compared to other neighborhoods lived in Powell Street before the Second World War. But as many of you may know, in the 1940s and 50s, the federal, provincial, and municipal governments worked in tandem to forcibly displace, intern, dispossess, and then disperse Japanese Canadians across the country and deport them to Japan. So our small and overwhelmingly assimilated communities today are a product of this violence. And for us then, places like Powell Street are precious. But the world has changed, and the politics of these places that are our historic homes are far more complicated than remembering one community's historic presence. The complicatedness of these politics is reflected in the short essay that Nicole and I, who are both mixed Japanese Canadian, wrote for 360 Riot Walk. And our main point was to explain that rather than refer to our community's historic home as Japantown, we call it Powell Street, and we explained why. To put it plainly, we wrote, the name Japantown is a problem because it risks further displacement in the neighborhood, the downtown east side. We go on to explain, while for some, calling Powell Street Japantown is a way to commemorate and claim the neighborhood as a Japanese Canadian place, others, so namely urban planners, policymakers, and politicians at the City of Vancouver, have capitalized on this move to commemorate in order to gentrify the neighborhood. And the problem then with the name Japantown is that it commemorates Japanese Canadian presence by threatening to facilitate other people's absence. And I'd like to explain a bit more about how that threat happens. And so one way to do that is to invite you to think of the Japantowns that you know of, maybe that you've visited. The first one that comes to mind for me is the one in LA, typically called Little Tokyo or sometimes J-Town, but the example still stands. So here's what LA's Little Tokyo or J-Town looks like. What you see before you is generally what gets envisioned both by city staff and even by Japanese Canadians themselves in conversations about commemorating our community's historic presence in Powell Street. And as it happens here in Vancouver, we do have somewhat of an example of this, though not of a neighborhood that already exists, but rather one that could exist, that could be rebuilt. What we have is a sketch. And this is the caption of the sketch. Conceptual illustration of Powell Street and Jackson Avenue during the annual Powell Street Festival in Oppenheimer Park, looking northwest, showing potential development, public realm enhancement, and local economic revitalization. So this sketch is included in a city document called the Downtown East Side Plan, which is the document that currently governs land use in the Downtown East Side. And apparently, the Downtown East Side Plan endeavors to maintain the existing neighborhood character and revitalize the area without displacement of residents, which sounds good, but I don't trust it because it looks to me like the word endeavors here is just doing some pretty heavy lifting. Like many people with ties to the Downtown East Side, I don't want to see any more displacement in the area. And I don't trust personally that the city is equipped to revitalize the neighborhood without displacing residents at this juncture anyway, no matter how much they endeavor to do so. So to give you a sense of why I'm so skeptical, I thought we can break down this sketch real quick. It's fascinating for lots of reasons, but I'm gonna just highlight two. So first, this sketch depicts the corner of Powell and Jackson, but not just on any old day. This sketch depicts the corner of Powell and Jackson during Powell Street Festival, an annual Japanese Canadian Arts and Culture Festival. Now this year in 2021, and last year due to COVID-19, Powell Street Festival has taken place in different ways, but typically the festival takes place in Powell Street and on 2 days of the year. So my question is, if Powell Street Festival only happens 2 days of the year, then what kind of benchmark is this for envisioning the overall potential development, public realm enhancement, and local economic revitalization of the area? What about the other 363 days of the year? What might the corner of Powell and Jackson look like then? So to me, the choice to depict the corner of Powell and Jackson during Powell Street Festival suggests that the city sees Japanese Canadian-ness as deeply tied to that potential development, public realm enhancement, and local economic revitalization. And that kind of Japanese Canadian-ness is much more accessible and indeed marketable through the name Japantown than it is through a name like Powell Street. This leads me to my second point about this sketch. By illustrating Powell and Jackson during Powell Street Festival, the city quite effectively escapes the complexity of what they are apparently through the Downtown East Side Plan trying to do, which, just to remind you, is to revitalize the area without displacement of residents. And I say this because looking at this picture, how can you tell who here is a resident? We might have our guesses for sure about which figures the artist drew, intending them to represent residents, and which figures the artist drew, intending them to represent non-residents. But my point is that because this scene depicts the neighborhood during Powell Street Festival, all of the people in this illustration basically just get reduced to festival goers. We can't tell who lives here and who doesn't. So for me, that begs the question, how important is the without displacement of residents part of the city's endeavors? We say Powell Street and not Japantown because of these kinds of maneuvers. I'll be quick here. Okay. At the same time, I've heard other arguments for why we should say Powell Street and not Japantown. And some of them, this is what I'm getting to the history part, draw on history, but not just history. They draw on historical accuracy. As it happens, the audio narration and written script of 360 Riot Walk reflects this inclination toward historical accuracy. At stop 9, the tour explains, on late Sunday afternoon, the rioters regrouped just to the east on Westminster, now Main Street. That was the entry to what the Japanese called Nihonmachi, which literally means Japantown, and Paorugai for the Powell Street area. And in fact, the piece that Nicole and I wrote for 360 Riot Walk draws on historical accuracy too. Referring to the name Japantown, we write, it was never used widely among Japanese Canadians living on Powell Street before the Second World War. Instead, they more often used Paorugai, translating to Powelltown, Powell Street, Powell Grounds, or Paoru. And this is all true. It is to say it's all historically accurate. But with all due respect to 360 Riot Walk and to my friend Nicole, and frankly to myself, and at the risk of sounding a bit facetious, who cares? Like, who cares about what Japanese Canadians really call this neighborhood, even if it was Japantown? If we know that now calling it Japantown risks further displacement. Now, I don't ask this question to make an argument against historical accuracy. Historical accuracy does matter, of course, but I worry that we have learned to value historical accuracy over, above, and beyond what's at stake when we tell certain histories. For me, thinking about the history of Powell Street in terms of what's at stake shows me that this is a matter of not just people's homes, but literally people's lives and deaths. It sounds dramatic and not a little accusatory, but it seems to me that the city, and frankly many Vancouverites, quite literally care more about the potential opportunity to eat overpriced ramen than they do about the lives of their neighbors. So I think that we need to consider not just what's at stake in the story of Powell Street or in any example, but what's at stake when we tell histories for accuracy, which is a trajectory that can lead us to the kind of like empiricism and what really happenedness that in a backwards kind of way actually ends up obscuring the very historical forces that made things happen the way that they did. So if there's one thing that I can leave you with today, it would be the idea that historical accuracy, though important, only gets us so far, and that we need to remember to read and write histories in ways that work for the present. In other words, histories that tell us what's at stake.
Thank you, Angela. And I'd like to thank everybody for their informed and provocative presentations. We were planning to do a round of sort of like internal panelists questions and comments, and we can still do that, but I'm curious because of time. We only have 18 minutes left before our 3:30 stagecoach turning into a pumpkin thing. I'm wondering if anyone in the audience has a comment or question they'd like to share with us. Ronald, you have a question? Would you like to ask it out loud? Or you want to type it in?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Great.
Would you mind turning on your camera just so we can connect with you visually?
My camera, it doesn't work right now. It has some blue tint on it, and you can't see anything out of it. That's why I don't have it on.
No, okay. Well, we'll just look at your still.
Sorry about that. Okay, question. Now, I found the talks to be very informative. It was a very good history lesson. Thank you all the speakers for that. I understand how this history lesson has created systemic racism in Canada, particularly in certain sectors more than others. And having grown up actually in Vancouver and in Chinatown in the 80s and 90s, 2000s, I saw a lot of it happen. But now we're in 2021. I'm curious and interested to know, where do you guys see racism today? Because for me, I'm always about what can we do today and now to change or make things better. Where do you see the gaps? I mean, there is definitely a large shift in terms of how politics and the city management and actually country and rural management sees racism. It's not the same as it was even 10 years ago. Where are the problem areas that you foresee, happening and coming up over the next couple of years?
Okay, anybody want to respond? Where is racism today?
I can respond in the context of like anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism. Obviously, this is a huge question of where racism is today and where we're going. But obviously with COVID, it demonstrated that it's still here and it's still prevalent and it hasn't gone anywhere. And what's really interesting is that a lot of folks I'm a millennial, so a lot of folks within my age, we didn't live through the 70s, 80s, where we saw sort of the pressures around urban renewal, etc. And everybody has thought, well, we're in that, we're model minorities, we're finally assimilated, we're close to whiteness. But with COVID, it really demonstrated that no, we're still the other. And when it is necessary to say, okay, let's blame it on a specific race and ethnicity, we are rolled out to demonstrate the worst and the best. And both of these situations is an act of racism. So I see a lot of folks my age kind of have a reckoning with racism and anti-Asian hate, and realizing the fact that we are still the other. And that has caused people to reflect, even myself, on the past, and that this is a continual story and this is a continual struggle to assert our place.
Thanks, Melody. Does anybody else want to address this? Angela, you have your cartoon hand up.
Yeah, I put a cartoon hand up. Yeah, I mean, I just thought, I mean, this is a large but great question. So thanks, Ronald. I was just going to add that I think something that is starting to come up is the term settler colonialism, which is often, it still feels like a very academic term. It's not, I don't feel like it's like quite public discourse kind of yet, but I think that racism today is sort of like people are trying to figure out how to occupy this position of being racialized and being a settler at the same time, particularly as we're seeing a rise new forms maybe of anti-Indigenous violence across Turtle Island. So I think that that's something that's maybe a little bit of this historical moment. And at the same time, speaking just to the Japanese Canadian community, I think that question of racism is really different because Japan occupies in East Asia, across Asia. You know, a lot of Imperial Japan leftovers, I feel like are hovering around our psyches and stuff, and that's myself included. I just feel like we don't talk about that a whole lot, but I do think that our relationship as Japanese diaspora, our relationship to racism is a different kind of reckoning.
Yeah, I can't help but think about the differences between institutionalized racism and individual acts of racism that are violent, right? So the way that the state can control our abilities and our bodies, yeah, there's been a certain amount of progress that's been happening for many decades. Is it enough? Hell no. Just look at Black Lives Matter and how Indigenous people are still being treated, etc. Immigration policy is still a pretty weird thing. I mean, there was a big leap forward after '67, but still, it's got, you know, is it just? Is it equal? Etc. Individual acts of violence. The torture of the Chinese houseboy back in the 30s, who was accused of killing that white woman who he worked for. Vincent Chin's murder down in Detroit, and the mowing down of the family in London, Ontario. You know, these individual acts where certain people feel they have right to lynch, or the equivalent of lynching. I mean, why does that keep on happening? So while these attitudes are still prevalent, certain actions are going to continue, right?
Sorry to add to that, Henry, you made me think. I think there's also a rise in comfortability in talking about racism. Like, I can't help but think that it's partly as a way to avoid talking about white supremacy, because that's like a much scarier sounding term for a lot of people, when of course they're inextricable. Yeah, like Michael's presentation made me think, if we called the race riots white riots, how many people would just be like so upset about that. But
Yes.
he's right, like that's true.
I've gotten enormous pushback for using that term, but to me, and this is where we can, our contingent coalitions, to me, have to be around anti-capitalism. And it strikes me, if I could put it in kind of motto format, that the way capitalism works is that it's not necessarily racist, it's just racist when necessary. And so you look at revanchism, another word for what you were talking about, both Melody and Angela, to the ways that people are dislocated and taken away from their homes and things, that, it's the way that capitalism works. And Vancouver is a particularly egregious example of this. And you can see it going back to covenants, land covenants, like on the North Shore, that are still in place in the British properties that prevent Asians from owning property there, and it's part of the covenants on the deeds. These still exist. So I mean, there are social and legalistic and political steps that can be taken to do this, and frankly, I just don't see the will to do that. I just don't see the political will to make it much of that happen. And, in many ways, and this applies also to issues for Indigenous people. And, one of the issues, for example, is when you talk about Powell Street, you're talking about Israel Wood Powell, who is the original Indian commissioner for British Columbia, who founded the first 5 residential schools in British Columbia. So, I mean, these issues are so complicated and so complex that, I mean, it's even, and I apologize for going over, but I'm having a really hard time compressing all this information into, a 10-minute talk. So, how do you get beyond those complications? Well, for me, the only way I can even begin to get into that is to talk about it in terms of capitalism, which brings in colonialism, imperialism, even things like revanchism. All of those things come under the umbrella of in a capitalist society. So, that's what I'm left thinking.
And what about the new capital coming in from Asia, from Hong Kong and China? Isn't that also going to displace poor people of whatever skin and ethnicity?
And that's kind of my point, Paul, is that instead of talking about that as Chinese, why don't we talk about that as capitalist rather than racializing that discussion? Because I mean, I hate to mention this, but there are Chinese capitalists.
And what I find so interesting is that now we're using capitalism, and capitalists are using anti-racism as a tool to further capitalism. So Angela was talking about how, to revitalize and to commemorate the place, you're using words like Japantown, you're using the Powell Street Festival as a way to, at the end of the day, benefit capitalism. or even maybe not here, but during COVID, in the States, there were conversations around like, we can't stop flights from China or from other countries because that is racist. And again, it's using anti-racism as a tool to keep those flight routes going, even though it is a public health measure. So now, or even during Black Lives Matter, we're seeing companies using anti-racism as a tool to market themselves. But at the end of the day, they're not really practicing it within their own companies and institution and culture. And so what we're seeing right now is using anti-racism as a way to further capitalism, which in and of itself is racism again.
And I think that's why people would get upset with you, Michael, for calling those riots white riots, is because that is actually turning towards like, okay, let's look at white supremacy here, and people don't want to do that because it forecloses opportunities like the ones Melody highlights. Like, I don't know, also like rainbow hockey sticks and stuff like that. Like, cool, everyone has a rainbow hockey stick. The culture of ice hockey is still like incredibly patriarchal and toxic. So yeah, those marketing, white supremacy is not, as you don't want to market that. That takes too much reflective work for people, many people.
Well, thank you. Do we have another question? One last question from the audience or comment? Cartoon hands, anybody? Or from the panelists, anybody have a burning question or comment for your co-panelists?
As an educator, I was wondering if, I don't know what the situation is in BC and other provinces as far as what kind of education are children getting these days about the history of race and the contributions of Asians in Canada. You know, has there been any change? And is it really different in BC from the rest of Canada, for example? Is there more reckoning going on in education?
I don't know for sure, but I don't know like curriculum, but I do know that on social media, the generation that's younger than me is like much more educated on issues of justice than I was. So I don't know if that's work they're doing themselves, possibly, but something's changed, it seems to me.
Well, I've got two kids who, well, they're not kids anymore, and they, who went through the school system with very different experiences. Everything depends on who your social studies teacher is. And there's going to be certain curriculum that's required, and there's all this other stuff where you choose your topics. So if you have somebody who is, who really wants the kids to be aware of more than the official histories that they grew up with, then they're going to get that. And if someone is very complacent, and I would even suggest complicit with the formerly official narratives of nation building and colonizing, etc., then that's what the kids are going to get. So it really depends. And so so there's a lot of work to promote certain alternative stories, but right now, yeah, there's still lots of flexibility. It's not like math.
And sometimes they'll say like, I think I learned that Japanese Canadians were evacuated from the West Coast. Like they'll use different language rather than say like forcibly uprooted. They'll choose a euphemistic word to describe the historical event, in addition to it being a blip in the curriculum.
What's it like in Ferndale or Washington State?
Unmute. I think it's much the same. A lot depends on the teacher. There really isn't much mandated curriculum. I guess someone, Imogen in the chat said that there is a BC curriculum, and I think BC has more of that, but I think it's largely the same depending on teachers. But I think there's a fear of teachers. I used to teach teachers, and there's a fear about talking about controversial things because of pushback from parents. So not every teacher wants to get into, systemic racism or white supremacy because they know they'll get some pushback.
Critical race theory.
Right.
Good luck with that.
I think what was really sad about my time in school, I went to South Dakota, was we had a lot of Japanese Canadian teachers who taught me, but we were never taught the Japanese internment. And it was these hidden histories when you were hanging out with your teacher. That's when you realized, and that's when they told you that they were part of internment. And so it's quite sad that, generations were not taught this history. I was really impressed with the initiatives in Bellingham with Paul. And in Vancouver, very similarly, there's been apology from both the BC government as well as the city of Vancouver. And through those initiatives, one of the things that they want to move forward with is to recognize the history and incorporate it into a curriculum. Whether that curriculum now becomes mandatory or optional, again, it's like what Henry says, really dependent on the teacher, whether they want to actually be there.
Okay, so we're now at 3:31, and I think Powell Street has a, do you guys do a hard stop? Or do we continue or what? Should I announce that the tickets for the walking tours are gonna be released? Yeah, on Eventbrite. The link is further up the chat column, although if you came in late and missed it, I don't know if you have access to it, because that's what Zoom does. You only get access to whatever, well, whenever you joined. But it's on Eventbrite, and if you look up 360 Riot Walk, I'm sure it'll take you there. I don't know. Am I calling the meeting now? Is this it? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you everybody who joined us today on this beautiful, warm, sunny day. I appreciate your taking your time out of your schedule to participate. And like I said, this is the final Talking the Walk panel discussion. This has been recorded. It will be posted within I suppose a few days up on YouTube, available 6 days, 7 days, within a week, maybe. And then yeah, you can watch it there if you want to relive the highlights or look at the previous two. So yeah, thank you everybody. And there's more comments in the column here. I don't know, am I allowed to just let people hang out and chat if they want to? Yeah, okay, yes, anybody who wants to hang out, or if you want to just grab yourself a drink and come back, although it's a bit early for me, but whatever, I won't judge.